Hi, welcome. I'm Sarah Steele. I'm the Sustainability Program Coordinator at the Academy of Natural Sciences of Drexel University. We're really delighted that you could join us tonight. If you're attending our programs for the first time, I'm going to give you a little bit of background. If you have heard this before, you can use the time to turn your cell phones off. The Academy has been around longer than any other natural science institute in the Western Hemisphere. We are a museum and an environmental research center and have been studying the interactions between humans and natural ecosystems for over 70 years. Since 2005, our department has hosted over 300 programs like this with the aim of creating a physical and intellectual space to discuss critical environmental and sustainability topics. The Academy enters its third century as an affiliate of Drexel University. This partnership allows two great institutions to promote world-class science and environmental sustainability. And through this collaboration, our goal is to be a regional powerhouse for environmental research, education, and programming. So here's the pitch. Consider becoming a member. You are the key to our success. Okay. We offer great benefits, including free admission to the museum and discounts on programs other than the free programs. And you will be supporting our region's lively sustainability conversation. I'd like to ask you, you got an evaluation in your programs. Please fill it out and leave it on the desk when you leave tonight. It really helps us to get answers to these questions to make these programs better and better.
Pay no attention.
I'm not paying attention to that man behind the curtain, or in front of the curtain. You tell me when. This is because we have two people at a time that will be at the podium. Okay. Okay. This is Rich Clark, our AV wizard, and we very much appreciate all of his efforts on our behalf. Okay, before we go any further, even though I said it before, as a courtesy to the rest of the audience and to the presenters, please put your cell phones on silent or off, even better. And it is now my pleasure to introduce Diana Lind, Executive Director and Editor-in-Chief of Next City. Diana?
Thanks so much for that. It's always great to be having an event here at the Academy of Natural Sciences. They're really our partner here in events in Philadelphia. So for those of you who don't know of Next City, we're an online publication focused on cities, and our mission as a nonprofit is to connect cities and inform the people working to improve them. And we do that in two critical ways. We publish high-quality journalism about best practices in cities across the country, hoping that one city will learn from another just by reading our stories online. And then secondly, we host events like these, where we actually bring people together from cities around the country in order to compare and contrast their approaches to solving some of the biggest urban challenges. So it was really great that we've been able to bring together people from Philadelphia, from Chicago, St. Louis, from New York, and really kind of look at this phenomenon of turning old industrial infrastructure into parks, and really rethink transportation, rethink livability, rethink green space, sustainability, and all these other issues. And this is the really perfect venue to do that. If you want to, I think we'll get a really great tour of all these different projects around the country, but if you want to learn even more, this event is in fact in some ways based upon a story that we published a couple weeks ago as part of our weekly series of long-form investigative reports called Forefront. And you can take a look at nextcity.org. At the Forefront page, you can browse through our archives, subscribe. It's $20 a year. You get access to all of our archive stories as well as a full year of stories going forward. And you also get to be invited to some really cool events here in Philadelphia. like tonight, we'll have a reception for our subscribers. So those are some of the perks that go beyond just reading the material online. This event and a lot of our Philadelphia content would not be possible without support from the William Penn Foundation, so I'd like to thank them. And I'd also really like to thank one of our local partners in crime here in Philadelphia, the Olin Studio, which has supported us. I think they were our hosts for the launch of our Philadelphia Focus, and it's really great that they could come back and help support us to pull together this event here tonight. So with that, I would like to introduce Ben Monette of the Olin Studio to introduce this evening's panel. Thanks so much.
Okay. Thank you so much for allowing us to sponsor this event, first of all, and thank you for showing up. We're really excited about this topic and about what it means for not only Philadelphia, but for all of our aging cities throughout America. I'd like to introduce at this time Beth White. Beth is the Chicago Region Director of the Trust for Public Land, TPL. She has a broad range of experience in planning, land conservation, historic preservation, and community building in both the governmental and nonprofit sectors. As the Chicago Region Director, Beth leads TPL's regional land conservation and park creation efforts to deliver on-the-ground results. TPL is a national organization that conserves land for people through conservation planning, finance, transactions, park design and development, and research and education programs. Prior to joining the Trust for Public Lands in 2006, Ms. White served as Managing Director in charge of communications, public policy, resource development, and intergovernmental relations for the Chicago Housing Authority's $1.5 billion plan for transformation. She has also served as the Chief of Staff to the Chicago Transit Board and directed the City of Chicago's $100 million Empowerment Zone program. She supervised the City of Chicago's City Space program and is the founding executive director of the Friends of the Chicago River, led the creation of the award-winning Chicago River Urban Design Guidelines. Ms. White also worked on the creation of the first Landmarks Protection Ordinance and staffed the Historic Preservation Commission for the City of Highland Park. As a civic leader, she spearheaded the designation effort that resulted in the Lakewood Balmoral neighborhood listing on the National Register of Historic Places. Ms. White is a member of the Board of Directors for Neighborhood Space, Partners for Parks and Wildlife Steering Committee, and a member of the Lambda Alpha International, Lambda Alpha International, an honorary land economic society. Ms. White also serves on the National Capital Planning Commission, appointed by President Obama. Ms. White holds a master's degree in urban studies from Loyola University and a bachelor's degree in communications from Northwestern University. So please join me in welcoming her.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that lovely introduction. And I'm just delighted to be here, and I'm heartened to see so many of you come out on a rainy night. But this is a very exciting time to be working and living in cities. And there's lots of innovation going on. There's lots of repurposing of our built environment. And it's not surprising that cities have also discovered that it's a really important thing to provide parks, trails, and public spaces. And city leaders are recognizing that parks are good for their economies. They're no longer just a nice thing to have, but a must. And so this combination of a bunch of infrastructure that is left over from our industrial past is growing in number. And so what do you do but put those two things together and take a look at how do you reuse this infrastructure to create parks for the future? There's lots of interesting examples that exist around the country where different cities have done different things. We're all familiar with rail trails of at-grade conversions, long greenways. But it's a new thing to take a look at elevated structures in cities. Other cities are looking at quarries and repurposing quarries for parks. Some are looking at airports. Some are looking at parking decks. But tonight you're going to hear about 4 examples of a growing collection of urban linear parks that are in various stages of development. Leah Murphy's elegant graphic that you see on the screen shows the footprint of these projects. They're at scale, and they give you a sense of the scope and the scale of these ambitious and complex projects. And while it's tempting to focus on the similarities, you know, they all have a unique feature in common, an elevated rail line in part or in whole as part of these projects. And while it's tempting to focus on that similarity, these projects are and will be very unique reflections of their cities. And because of that, they couldn't be more different from one another. So tonight, what we want to do is talk about this drive to create these urban linear elevated rail parks and what's happened because of it. It's really sparked great imagination, passion, and a renewed interest in the power of parks to create livable cities. I really want to thank Next City for what they do. I think it's a pretty unique organization. And it's really a treat that they bring together a community of very like-minded folks to compare notes and help one another achieve these visions and bring them to reality. So tonight's format, we're going to give you brief presentations on these 4 projects. The presenters are going to give you a sense of the scope and the scale and where they are in their various developments. We'll have a panel discussion that I'll moderate, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers at the end. And now I want to tell you a little bit about our wonderful panelists. They each bring a unique perspective. They have varied backgrounds. They bring a different set of skills, but they all have 2 things in common. They care very deeply about cities, and they're people who can make things happen. So I'm just delighted to tell you about them. I'm going to introduce each one of the panelists, and then I'm going to bring the first one up to give you their very brief presentation. The first panelist I want to introduce is Todd Antoine. He's the Deputy Director for Planning at the Great Rivers Greenway District in St. Louis, Missouri. The primary focus of his work is to develop and implement the River Ring, a regional interconnected system of greenways, parks, and trails. And he coordinates the efforts to establish partnerships with local, state, and regional entities in the implementation of the River Ring. Currently, he's working on plans for the Trestle, which you see up in the top right-hand corner, a 1.5-mile linear park and trail. He's the past president of the St. Louis Metropolitan Section of the American Planning Association, and prior to joining Great Rivers Greenway, he worked on the East-West Gateway Council of Governments in St. Louis. He's an American Planning Association member, he's American Institute of Certified Planners, and he received his master's degree in urban affairs from St. Louis University. Ben Helfand is the co-founder and board president of Friends of the Bloomingdale Trail. It was formed in 2003. The Friends advocates for the conversion of the underused Bloomingdale Rail embankment into an elevated multi-use linear park and trail. In his day job, he is the director of NeighborSpace, a nonprofit urban land trust dedicated to preserving and sustaining community-managed open spaces in Chicago. He also serves as a board member on the Active Transportation Alliance, and in 2012 was awarded a Chicago Community Trust Emerging Leader Fellowship, looking at urban ag and community stewardship. Paul Levy is the founding chief executive of Philadelphia's Center City District, and he served in that capacity since January 1991. The Center City District is a $20 million downtown management district which provides security, cleaning, place marketing, promotion, planning, and capital improvement services. Currently, they're overseeing a $50 million reconstruction of Dilworth Plaza, adjacent to City Hall, and securing more than $40 million in federal, state, and local grants and private contributions to pay for the project, which will be completed in spring 2014. He's a noted expert on urban affairs and urban development, teaches at the University of Pennsylvania, and was just recently in Chicago providing some expert advice to some of our colleagues back in Chicago. Leah Murphy is a senior associate with Interface Studio. I thank Leah again for producing our slide. Interface is a Philadelphia-based collaborative urban design and planning consulting firm honored with 3 National American Planning Association awards, as well as the 2013 National Planning Excellence Award. Since the early stages of the nonprofit organization Friends of Rail Park, Leah has played a very important role in the organization's development as a board member since summer 2011. She got her undergraduate education at the University of Pennsylvania and a master's of urban planning with a concentration in real estate and urban development from Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. Danya Sherman is the director of Friends of the Highline's Programs, Education, and Community Engagement Department. She joined Friends of the Highline in 2007, and together with partnering neighborhood and cultural organizations, her department produces over 450 public events and activities each year on the Highline. She's a very busy lady. She's a public member of Community Board 4's Parks and Waterfront Committee on behalf of the Friends of the Highline. And before joining the Friends, she worked as an environmental educator and community organizer in New York and Chicago. She has a BA in Science and Society from Wesleyan University in Connecticut. And Jamie Simone, who is the program director for the Urban Parks Program and the Chicago office of the Trust for Public Land, has a wide range of experience in community outreach, urban design, research, and project management. Currently, she's the program director for the Urban Parks Program in Chicago and working 99.99% of her time on the creation of the Bloomingdale. Prior to serving as program manager, she worked at the Wicker Park Bucktown Chamber and was the Special Service Area Program Director for the 2 neighborhoods. She led her commission through several community-based planning processes and culminated in a master plan, which has won 4 different awards. And before joining urban planning as a profession, she worked in the field of social service, where she learned countless lessons about human interaction and the boundless power of listening. And I think that's a lovely way to sort of end the introductions and ask Danya to come up and begin the presentations for you, because the power of listening in this line of work can't be overstated. And we want to hear from you later and listen to your good thoughts and ideas. But for now, I'd love to bring Danya forward to tell you about the Highline.
Thank you so much, Beth, and thank you to Next City and to the Academy of Natural Sciences for having us here. It's really exciting to be here. I think each of us spend a lot of time speaking about our projects individually, but it's very rare that we have the chance to speak together in a forum that allows us to sort of compare and contrast the projects. And as Beth mentioned, I think one of the things that you'll notice is that each of our projects has a lot to do with the cities that we're located in, and each has its own specific local context. And there are costs and benefits of being located in Manhattan, and I think that one of the interesting things about it is that it's opened us up to receive a lot of attention, and I think it's one of the reasons that we have received a lot of attention for the Highline. And I think that that, in turn, has sort of opened us up to a lot of praise and also a lot of critical feedback. One of the things that I think is good about that, not only does it allow sort of the Friends of the Highline to make our work better as we listen to that feedback, but I think also sort of the amount of dialogue about our project has hopefully sparked conversations like this and allowed us to all talk about the interesting similarities and a lot of the differences between the different projects that we're all working to create. So yeah, with that, I'd like to tell you a little brief history of the Highline with a special focus on some of the qualities that I think have made our project happen. And again, I run the public programming and community relations for the Highline, and the Friends of the Highline is a nonprofit organization that runs the park on behalf of the City of New York Parks Department. So basically sort of a brief history of how we got from here in 2000 to what it looks like now, when it opened, and now in 2009. The story began in the 1850s, as many of the stories of the structures here did. Freight trains used to run on the streets of Manhattan, carrying mostly food-related goods to and from the warehouses and factories that were on the Lower West Side of Manhattan. And they ran on the street until, sort of in the turn of the century, it became more and more of a problem as the city was developing because it caused a lot of traffic and was a big, big safety issue for the city. And so in 1934, they finished elevating the tracks to address that safety concern. They finished building the High Line as part of a larger public-private works project called the West Side Improvement Project. And I mentioned that it's public-private because I think it's interesting to see that thread continue through the current development of the High Line and a lot of our projects. And so it ran as an active freight line from 1934 through 1980, but starting in the 50s and in the 60s, the rise of interstate trucking and the growth of highways really took over as the main way that America moved its freight and food-related goods around the country. So lines like the High Line were sort of falling into disuse. Until finally in 1980, the last train ran on the High Line, and then nature took over, and also people started to come up and make their mark on sort of an otherwise disused space. And in 2000, this is sort of what it looked like. So enter two community residents, Robert Hammond and Joshua David. They would laugh if they saw me using this picture, so that's why I used it. But I think that one of the qualities that has made us really successful is their leadership. But they weren't leaders before. They had no relevant experience and were doing very, very different things. But they happened to read the same article about the planned demolition of the High Line and went to a community board and happened to sit next to each other and started to talk about what it would mean to try to save the structure, although there were many, many obstacles. But it really has been their leadership that I think has been a lot of the reason for our success. One of the first things that they did was create sort of a moment of inspiration for the city. They brought a landscape photographer up to the High Line to take photographs of the park throughout all 4 seasons. His name is Joel Sternfeld. And this allowed them to bring other people along into sort of the idea of, wouldn't it be cool to do something with this? And that was really helpful as a first step. Another thing that really helped us was opposition. Mayor Giuliani was the mayor at the time, and he wanted to tear down the High Line and was in the process of tearing down the High Line because he thought it was an impediment to developing the neighborhood. And there were several landowners and developers and neighborhood residents who also thought that it would be a waste of money to save it and an impediment to the neighborhoods developing further. And so this was a newsletter that they sent around when we were first starting out. But that really helped us sort of create a rallying cry, that sort of sense of opposition. And then sort of in contrast, we had to build our own coalition around supporting the High Line. And so when Mayor Bloomberg came into power in 2002, he was really supportive of the project, as were many other of our local elected officials, our senators, our city council people, our state senators. And learning how to work with each of them for their own reasons was one of the things that, that really helped, and their support was vital to saving the park, obviously. Another thing that we never shy away from is expressing our personality as part of the organization. The top is a photo that Robert and Josh took with a local meatpacking restaurant owner named Florent, which has since closed, but he is dressed as Highline Marie Antoinette at an early fundraiser for us. And then just below, again, sort of starting to throw parties very early on as a way of sort of creating excitement around what it means to be a part of Friends of the Highline, which was really just an idea at that point. And then another thing that they were very smart about was the idea of creating buzz. So learning to work with people of high profile, such as Edward Norton and Kevin Bacon, was something that they felt was important. Again, sort of wanting to get other people excited about being part of a project that people of high profile were a part of. So that was something that helped us a lot along the way. We had someone design us a logo very early on in the process, and Robert always jokes about how for a long time he and Josh, or the whole Friends of the Highline was just 2 volunteers and a logo. And that was really helpful, I think, because it created an identity for us. And that sort of focus on good aesthetics and insistence on good aesthetics is sometimes very annoying for me, but has I think, been really helpful in creating and maintaining that identity. We were also very insistent on the importance of dialogue with the public and members of the community around the High Line. So we went through about 15 community input sessions as we were designing the High Line. The architects would come out and we would do sort of charrettes that were open to the public, and much as you're, I think, starting to do here in Philly. And that was really important for us to have a sense of dialogue and open conversation about what it could be, what could the High Line be. As was sort of a sense of community building. We had a lot of people coming out to community board meetings, to city council meetings to advocate for the High Line. We worked with hundreds of volunteers to help us do cleanups and run our events and all that kind of stuff, and that really helped to create a sense of ownership and a really large sort of sense of community by the time that we opened the park. We also didn't shy away from the business aspect of it. When Mayor Bloomberg came into power, he was excited about the project and supportive of it, but he wanted to know what the economics of it were. So we commissioned an economic impact study that showed that, that people will pay more to live and work around small parks in Manhattan, and that the investment that the city would have to make to build the park would eventually be outweighed by the new tax revenue that was created. So that was really what helped bring the mayoral administration around in the end. We also worked with the Department of City Planning. They had, as I mentioned, Giuliani wanted to tear down the High Line in order to develop the neighborhood. So they were already sort of thinking about how they were going to turn what was a sort of an old manufacturing and industrial area into something that was a little bit more vibrant. And so in 2005, the Department of City Planning rezoned West Chelsea as including the High Line. And what it did was make it possible for the people who were owning land underneath the High Line to realize the value of their land, to not lose the value of their land if we saved the High Line, by creating sort of a market for them to be able to sell their development rights. And then by sort of the end of 2005, it was time to create a design for the High Line. And so we held a design competition and chose the firm James Corner Field Operations to lead the design, and Diller Scofidio and Renfro and Pete Udolph to work on the design of it. And their basic idea is creating an integrated landscape, meaning that all of the pieces of the park sort of fit together in sort of a puzzle, is the way I think about it. So the plantings are sort of merging into the walkways, the benches and the lighting and the water fountains are all sort of integrated into one design. And that's helpful, I think, to not distract people as they're walking along the High Line. And we're still building the third section, just to give you a sense. So the High Line right now is 1 mile long. Sections 1 and 2 are open. And next year, we're going to be opening section 3, which goes from 30th to 34th Street and goes even further closer to the water. So as I mentioned before, the High Line was originally built as part of a public-private partnership and is now, was rebuilt and is now operated as a public-private partnership. So the City of New York owns the structure under the Parks Department, and Friends of the High Line manages and operates the park on behalf of them, and through that raise 90% of the operating budget per year for the High Line. So all of the staff, so it's 2 guys with a logo going over to staff running, you know, the custodial teams, the horticulture teams, our programming, teen staff, lots of different things to do to maintain and operate the structure. These are some of our gardeners recently working on our annual spring cutback. And so what has the impact of the High Line been? So I think, oops. Okay, some of the numbers are missing. But basically, this shows you that second bar to the right is where our visitorship level is. Last year, it was 4.5 million people, and that was completely unanticipated. We thought that we were going to get about 300,000 visitors per year when we opened the High Line. So that we really were not prepared for the level of visitorship that we've gotten. And a lot of people do sort of think that we're a tourist destination, and so we did a visitor survey in 2010, and we're going to be updating it again this year, that showed that 55% of our visitors are from the New York City metropolitan area, 27% are United States visitors, tourists, and 18% international tourists. So that just sort of shows you some of the things that have happened since we've opened. We also did an update to our economic impact study that estimated these very large numbers, which is exciting to see and was important for us to be able to show that really sort of ended up working out in favor of the economy. But because we have become such a destination and received more visitors from outside New York than we anticipated, we really focus a lot of the organization's initiatives on New York City and making sure that our food vendors and our kids programs and our sort of dance parties and our art are really geared towards people coming back over and over again and building a relationship with the High Line as opposed to just coming once and leaving. And that's part of what I'm charged with doing, and so that's sort of what we've been working on building the last few years. One of the other things that we have been trying to do is to look at what communities around the High Line and around New York are not as engaged as others. There are two public housing complexes right near the High Line that together hold about 5,000 residents. And we were tabling in front of one of the community centers there a couple years ago, and people were a little bit less familiar with the High Line than we expected. And so we started what we're calling sort of a community engagement initiative, which started with a surveying initiative at the Fulton houses and the Elliott Chelsea houses to try to understand what people would want from the High Line, what is the relationship that they currently have with it, and what could we do to build upon that. And one of the, some of the things that people told us was that they're interested in teen sort of things to do for teens, employment, and gardening. And so we started a program called the Green Corps, which is a teen gardening program. And this is our second year doing it, and it's been really successful. One of the teens, Carla in the jean jacket, just recently got a full-time job from a place that came to visit during the program. And so I think what's really great about this, besides sort of helping to engage local residents, is that I think, again, sort of shows that when you open, you don't know exactly what's going to happen, and that it's important to continue having an open dialogue and building upon the feedback that you get from your constituents. And that's something that we really try to do, and that I think the Green Corps is sort of an example of. And so that's my little brief history of the High Line. I'll be here for questions, obviously, afterwards.
Well, thanks, Danya, for the great start to the presentation tonight. I think you'll see there are a lot of similarities between the two projects, but of course we're not built yet. Once again, I'm Jamie Simone, and this is Ben Helfand, and we'll be talking about the Bloomingdale in Chicago. So to help you get oriented, this is part of the city of Chicago. We have downtown in this area. Here's the loop. The Bloomingdale line is about 4 miles from the downtown area on the near northwest side. It spans 4 neighborhoods. There's Wicker Park, Bucktown, Logan Square, and Humboldt Park, not the same Logan Square you have here, obviously. It includes 3 wards, so there are 3 aldermen, 3 elected officials that are a part of the project. It has great street and transit connections, which you'll see through some of the slides. And in the future, we hope to get the project to the Chicago River, which you can see is just east of where the end of it is right now. It's a much more complicated equation to get there, so we've stuck with going from Ashland Avenue west to Ridgeway, which is just under 3 miles. Ben will talk more about the history in depth when he gets to his part of the presentation, but it was a freight line, much like the High Line, on an elevated embankment for most of its 100-year history. Now you can see it sits as a barrier, this is it here, it kind of sits as a barrier between the neighborhoods But from this aerial view, which was taken from a helicopter by one of our traffic reporters, you can see that there's great potential for it to become a connector and more of a green seam stitching together communities as opposed to this gray infrastructure piece that kept neighborhoods from each other. This is a pretty typical view of what the structure itself looks like. So it goes over 38 bridges, spans 38 roads. One of those is an alley. The majority of the bridges are constructed like this. They're concrete with a center pier in the middle for support. The embankment walls are also concrete, and we've learned through extensive engineering testing and study that they're solid concrete with no steel reinforcement. And at the base down here, which you can see, it's all closed up, but if you could see under here, it's 9 feet thick and then gets thinner as it goes towards the top. So it's a very substantial structure. For the most part, the structure's in good shape. Just needs some patching, as you can see from this image. But it has maintained its structural integrity over the 100 years it's been there. This is another view, again, of a typical view of the Bloomingdale, 16 feet up in the air. But I think this image helps illustrate some interesting parts of the project. You can see a little bit better the scale here with the car and the cyclist. It is 16 feet up in the air. You can see the great connections that I was talking about. This is Damon Avenue, which provides, from the trail, provides access to the busiest commercial street along the 38 roads. And you can see there's a striped bike lane that goes up and down Damon Avenue. Just south of this location is where the Blue Line train comes, so there's great transit and other types of connections. And thirdly, you can see, excuse me, just how intimate some of the neighboring buildings are with the trail. This townhouse complex that you see in the back there is at the same level of the trail, but it demonstrates a similar characteristic of some other buildings that are in this area where some of the second-story buildings look right out onto the trail. So you can imagine that this has been a source of concern for some of these neighbors. But fortunately for us and fortunately for the project, none of those concerns have ever raised to the level of organized opposition.
So, like so many things in Chicago, the story begins with the Great Fire. And after the fire, the city council gave permission to the railroad to build, like in New York, a railroad, on the street, on Bloomingdale Avenue. And that was fine for a little while, but Chicago's rose from the ashes very quickly, and the population boomed. And very, very soon, there was a lot of conflict with the trains. More conflict is not the right word, because we saw a lot of articles like this. People were getting killed, people were getting maimed. We think of it these days, if suburban rail in Chicago, if somebody gets hurt or killed, it's all over the news that night. And imagine if that was happening every few days. That's what they were facing at the turn of the last century. And so what happened was what we like to think of as kind of the community bookends of what our effort has been the last decade or so. Coalitions of community groups and churches banding together, demanding and fighting that the city council get the railroad to raise the line. And they eventually won. And it's very interesting for me to learn that it's not just Chicago, but it's all over the place that this happened in the progressive era. And so they ordered that the lines were raised, and Bloomingdale was raised almost exactly 100 years ago. So we're celebrating the centennial of Bloomingdale this year. And so this is a picture during construction. The engineers always like us to say that they won awards back then in the engineering magazines because they kept the line going during construction, which is amazing. And you also get to see a glimpse here of what Jamie was talking about, of just kind of the monolith that was built here. It was man-made, and it's kind of industrial. I like to think of it as an industrial version of some of the older mounds that were in Illinois and Ohio. That it's a new monolith. So, for 100 years, this served a kind of a vibrant corridor of factories. A lot of lumber mills, furniture manufacturers, instruments. Schwinn Bicycles had a parts facility along there. It was booming until about in the 60s and 70s. It's a typical story. Things really started to slow down. This is in the early 90s, one of the last trains to go over the line, delivering ingredients to candy factories on where there used to be candy factories in Chicago. So it's nice to get a bird's eye view of that. A couple years later, about 93, this is what it looked like. Nature really quickly took over, as it does. and the trees grew up really quickly. They put a clamp on the tracks so trains could not go across it anymore. And you got some really wonderful, you got some weeds, but you also got some wonderful prairie plants, wildflowers, birds started to come back. And my favorite thing is right over here, this little desire line, the little trail over there on the right. This is what it looked like when I scrambled up there and trespassed 11 years ago. I wasn't the first person who was there. I was like many of the fellow people in my neighborhood, just looking for a place to get away from it all, looking for a little bit of fresh air. And what I found was a de facto open space, a very, very long, narrow forest preserve or park running through my neighborhood, and I thought it was absolutely wonderful. The community's discovery of the line had happened, or at grade had happened long before. Going back about 40 years, you've seen incredible murals happening along the line. This is one of the oldest ones on California Avenue. This is a more recent one, a modern retelling of Guernica. And people really just used it as an open space. So this is more recent, people using it as a jogging path. Even though it was trespassing, the Chicago runners declared it one of the best jogging paths in Chicago. And a lot of people discovered it for more quiet things, not just for recreation, but also just a place to sit quietly. The planning process really started in the 90s in Chicago. The city had ranked in something called the City Space Plan, a comprehensive open space plan. They'd ranked the community areas, 77 community areas, by open space, and it showed that Logan Square, on the northwest part of the trail, had the second least amount of open space in the city. Humboldt Park, to its south, had the sixth least amount of open space, and this was something needed to be done. So they embarked upon the Logan Square Open Space Plan, and there was a series of community meetings, and they were trying to remedy the situation you see on your right. There's an inordinate number of children that live within walking distance, 22 schools nearby the trail, and this is where they were playing. And we got lots of pictures like this, because there really was very few places to go. And the Chicago's Plan Commission adopted the Logan Square Open Space Plan in 2004. At the meetings for the Open Space Plan is when the Friends of the Bloomingdale Trail found each other. We were, like myself, pedestrian advocates. There were cyclists. There were people looking for better ways to get to school, to get around their neighborhoods, and they all found each other. And we realized that the Bloomingdale, you saw it was a dividing line between neighborhoods. And I think we thought that unless there was a group from all four of the neighborhoods along the route that were championing it and keeping it on the front burner, that it might be another plan that ended up on a shelf and that never went anywhere. So we set out, I think, expecting a lot more opposition, expecting our aldermen and other people to a lot more NIMBYism. What we found was people really kind of liked the idea. All the aldermen, one by one, supported it. Community groups formally endorsed it. We went and met with the mayor, and he supported it. So we didn't have to fight some of the battles that were fought with the High Line. We focused on keeping the pressure on and making sure that the project that we loved, found the funding that it needed, because it didn't have a price tag attached to it at the beginning. And we did things that, I like to point out the map. We did a lot of maps, because I'm a firm believer that if you map something, soon it will magically become a reality. So we did maps, and sure enough, a couple years later, the Chicago bike map had a nice little dotted line on Bloomingdale. It wasn't a reality, but it was part of the plan. So we also engaged the arts community into this original screen prints. We came up with any excuse we could to get people out and up there, because for the most part, people just went under this thing and they never thought about it like any other viaduct in Chicago. So we invented invasive species poles, and walks and runs and bike rides and a docent program and created an educator's packet to reach out to the schools. In about 2005, I think really looking at the High Line, we got the idea in our head with the Chicago Architecture Club that we needed to do a competition. And what we learned very quickly was that when we started talking to Trust for Public Land and the city and others, was that you don't just do a competition for competition's sake. They did it because they really needed it as a tool to reach certain ends and convince people. So we backed off of that, and what we did was a big exhibition of all the existing visions of the trail. A lot of universities had looked at the trail for design studios, but they had rarely been seen beyond the confines of their review. And so we showed that off to all of Chicago, and I think it really raised the level of people's thinking about what was possible. We built off the success of the Logan Square Open Space Plan with our own community visioning process. We had a bilingual survey that went out to about 700 community members and did some charrettes. And it kind of set the tone for some of the things that you'll hear that happened in the later planning processes about arts integration. And I think really importantly that from the very beginning, Bloomingdale was thought of as a multi-use trail, walking, biking, and I think as importantly, a place to sit. People said that in our surveys as much as anything else, just a place to sit and enjoy nature. In 2006 is when Trust for Public Land entered the picture. And I'll let Jamie take it from there.
So yes, as Ben said, 2006 was the first time that the Trust for Public Land became formally involved with the project. At the time, I was actually just getting involved as a board member of the Friends of the Bloomingdale Trail organization. And this is long before I became employed by the Trust for Public Land. But the Friends of the Bloomingdale Trail knew about the Trust for Public Land because of some other work we had done at a neighborhood park in Logan Square. And so they knew the kind of work that we did with land acquisition and donating land to the city to become park space. And so they found this piece of property for sale. This is what it looked like before. And they came to the Trust for Public Land and said, you know, we think this would be a great access point for the Bloomingdale Trail. This back here is the embankment wall. And so it's directly adjacent to the trail. And so they came to the Trust for Public Land and said, we think you should buy this as a future access point. And at that time, there was no strategy for access. There was no planned map. And so it helped push that conversation forward. So the Trust for Public Land went to the city of Chicago. I'll mention now that this is now, of course, been purchased by the Trust for Public Land and donated to the city. It's a park. This is the Bloomingdale line here, you can see. And so there's a beautiful park there now, just waiting for the access ramp to be built to go up to the top. But at that time, in the absence of an access map, there was no reason for the Trust for Public Land to purchase it, or there was no strategy, which helped create this map, which the city produced, again, with the help of the Trust for Public Land, establishing a strategy for access. And it's hard to read the numbers on here, but all of these access points, these proposed access points, were no more than a half-mile apart. So there started to be a strategy about access and then a plan that was put forward. And I think that that's also really helpful in communicating with the public how access for this park will be planned and how it will be, how organizations like the Trust for Public Land could pursue land acquisition, or the city itself pursue land acquisition for future access parks. Fast forward a few years, in 2010 was when the Trust for Public Land established a formal relationship with the Chicago Park District as funding through the federal government became available to do a phase 1 analysis. So the city had won CMAQ money, which is congestion mitigation and air quality. Again, as Ben had said, this had always been envisioned as a route for cyclists in addition to people walking and running. And since it ties into some of the other transportation and transit assets that we have, as I showed earlier, the project was eligible for these funds. So those funds were initially used to do a phase 1 preliminary engineering and design. So this is the first public meeting that was held in second?
No, I'm saying.
Oh, okay. Sorry. This was the first public meeting that was held in September of 2011, where things were really kicked off with a design team. And you can see there are many people here. And at the time, and we still continue, the Trust for Public Land, to work on behalf of the Park District as their owner's representative, and we lead the civic engagement. So following up after that, in October, we held a 4-day charrette at the McCormick Tribune YMCA, which is at the western end of the trail. This is one of my favorite images from that 4-day charrette. It's a 40-foot long aerial of the entire trail, and people were having these little post-it note conversations back and forth about how they envisioned the trail of the future. They also did small group discussions where they talked about things like access and circulation and safety and the arts, just about every topic you could think of. They built little maquettes of the trail and just sort of dreamed about what they thought could be a reality. Through that whole process, lots of community interaction, both in large meetings and small meetings. In the end, it culminated in some very technical documents about bridge conditions that were forwarded then to the Department of Transportation at the state level, but the more public deliverable at the end of that process was a framework plan, which you can see on the website, but it established some core values that we still work with today that were the underlying framework. One of them being about sustainability, both financially and environmentally. and the other being that everything be developed with the community, which is something that we still continue to do now. These are the objectives that come in the plan. So in the framework plan, these are these 6 or 7 objectives, and then underneath each objective there are implementation strategies and different design guidelines, again, that we still refer back to now. So we're now in the second phase of the project, where the final design is complete. We're awaiting approval from the state to move forward to advertise the job, and we hope to be under construction by the end of July. And the project will be done by fall of 2014, at least the basic path, safe and accessible end-to-end with all the access ramps. But one of the objectives was to highlight the unique assets of the trail. So in this slide, you can see we have no topography in Chicago, so people are really excited about the opportunity to dig down into those embankment walls and create some hills, which also is an opportunity for the landscape architects to play with a drier soil versus a wetter soil, so it allows for some variety in the plant life that will be there. And this is just to leave you with a typical section of how we think that the trail will look. So on the right-hand side, you can see there's the shared use path. And then on the left-hand side, to help please people like Ben, the pedestrian here to my left, there's a little nature path in some areas. Most of the trail is only 30 feet wide, so these opportunities for the smaller nature trail that will be a little bit more overgrown and a little bit more about discovery can only happen in limited segments, but I think it's part of the trail that people are really excited about when they do want to be up there with their children and just kind of taking a stroll and taking it easy up there. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Todd Antoine. I work for the Great Rivers Greenway District in St. Louis. I'm just curious, who here has been to St. Louis or have actually seen the Trestle? Have they been there? Oh, actually, okay, there's quite a few. Well, what I thought I would do today is just give you a sort of a brief history on the Trestle, and then kind of talk a little bit more about Great Rivers Greenway and kind of what's unique about it among what's happened in New York and Chicago so far is that our regional agency is working on it, which I think is different than the Friends organization. But at the end of the story, I'll get back to how we're actually doing a Friends group now too. But the Trestle, similar to the other projects that we saw, was built back in the 1920s, and it served actually as part of the Illinois traction system in St. Louis. It actually connected to many communities in central and southern Illinois. It was really a sort of a commuter line, and then it actually extended far into Illinois. It serviced freight until the late 90s or so and everything. And then through the Trust for Public Land in 2004, if I hit this correctly here, there we go. Through the Trust for Public Land in 2004, they purchased it for us, and then we bought it from them. So really in 2005 or so, we kind of really advanced forward on this portion of it that was constructed in 2007. Illinois Department of Transportation was rebuilding McKinley Bridge, which is the bridge you see in the background. So a part of it was built, but because we were trying to play catch up with Illinois Department of Transportation to meet their schedule to get it built, you can kind of see it's a very bland, boring, nothing but concrete. We've got some benches. There's landscape towards the part where it touches down, but it's really kind of just this very bland experience in that we've always envisioned at the time, we said, the High Line was really coming online at that point in the planning and moving towards construction. We said, we've really got to do a better job than just have something like this. And that my goal is that once we get the other portion of it done, which I'll show you, we'll come back and be able to go back and retrofit this and really make it a much better experience. But that did open back in 2007. But kind of just to give you just a little bit of a context for where I work, Great Rivers Greenway District was a regional park and greenway district that was created by the voters in St. Louis City, St. Louis County, and St. Charles County. So we covered 1,200 square miles, pretty much the heart of the metropolitan St. Louis area on the Missouri side. We're funded by 1/10 of 1 cent sales tax, which generates about $11 million. And I'll mention this towards the end, we actually just went back to the voters here earlier this month for an increase in that, and we were successful. But right now, we generate $11 million, which really helps us to build what we call the River Ring, which is this interconnected system of greenways, parks, and trails. This is from our regional plan that we did back in 2004 that kind of shows this interconnected system primarily along our rivers and riparian corridors throughout the 3 jurisdictions. right now we're working on about 17 of those corridors. There's about 45 of them here on this map. So, and the Trestle is highlighted right there with the circle, is pretty much right next to downtown St. Louis. This kind of just shows you a better map, and I'll just kind of walk through some of these slides here. So you can see downtown here in the red, and then the new I-70 bridge, which is under construction right now, and then the Trestle will be coming in here. But we're kind of, as you can kind of see, it's kind of in a part of the city grid where you've got the orientation of the river changes and the street grid pattern changes right here. The Trestle, you'll see it will be coming up right through here. And then this kind of shows you the existing open space and trail system right now along the Mississippi River. The arch, just for folks who aren't familiar, the arch is right here in downtown, with the heart of downtown right here. But this is our North Riverfront Trail, which is a 12-mile bike and pedestrian path that comes up along the Mississippi. That portion that I showed the picture of that was built in 2007 is this little portion right here that comes up across the bridge and connects into Illinois. And then, too, you can kind of see down here, which is an important part of the conversation for later, is our Gateway Mall, which is about a 22-block open space that was created back in the 1920s from doing a corridor plan, looking at how to connect from the riverfront out to the western part of downtown. And so here's kind of just another map that kind of shows you some of the different efforts going on. And one of the things, too, I'll mention is the City Arch River, which was in Next City a few weeks ago. There was an article talking about that with the recent vote as well. But that's all going on right here at the Arch grounds. Then the Trestle is coming down. And really what we really see being important with the Trestle is not just how it is this elevated structure that really for folks to be able in the neighborhood to get out for a walk or for someone to get a bike ride, but really how does it connect better into the whole regional system of greenways and parks and trails, which given the location and given some of the challenges that it has there in its proximity, I think it really is the key to it, especially in St. Louis, is how does it connect into the greater trail network. And so that's the 1.5 miles of the elevated section right now that you saw earlier on the opening slide. But really what we're looking at doing is a full connection, which is about 6 miles of a loop that would be through connecting to the existing open space. So these are just the various segments that we have right now with what's in green at the top is the existing half-mile segment or so that's been open since 2007. And then it touches down right there at that dotted line and then elevates again with a solid orange or red as it goes over and then comes down at grade again right here. So you can kind of see with this new bridge coming in right here, you've got a lot of folks that are going to be seeing it. This is Interstate 70 right here, the existing Interstate 70, and so the new ramps that all tie in. Kind of what I thought just to show for the neighborhood context, and really once I start to show images and you'll kind of understand this a little bit better, is that it's everything that's kind of on the east side of Interstate 70, which is basically all this direction, is a typical fashion of what happened in urban areas and cities around our country when you had highways go through and really bisect neighborhoods and businesses and whatnot, and so that you've got this highway right here it's elevated as it comes up, and then it's in a trench, and then it comes at grade as it heads north. But it really cuts off the neighborhood and access for folks who want to safely get across and get over here to the Riverfront Trail. We have this sort of working industrial riverfront. The actual port of the city of St. Louis is actually located right here, which received quite a bit of stimulus dollars from the federal government to upgrade it and whatnot. So we've got that there, and then this urban corridor along Broadway. So there's lots of different environments that the Trestle goes to in a very short distance. And so I thought I'd just take you through just a couple shots so you can kind of see as we head north. So this is the new Mississippi River Bridge. It's about a $700 million project that's going to be built in 2014, taking what we do have 3 interstates on one bridge and moving one of them, Interstate 70, off onto this new bridge. So that's a big project. That's been an initiative that the 2 states have been working on, I think, for the past 15 or so years. One of the things I'm really proud of is this past summer, is because of that new bridge construction, we went in and we actually painted the portion of it over the interstate highway. We've done this in a similar project, another trail that we have in their area that crosses over the interstate. But really, we wanted to do this not only because we could save money as all the road construction was going on and whatnot, but we also could help raise awareness of the project in the district and such. And so that project, we spent about $1.5 million last summer to actually paint it and preserve it and do some maintenance on it, and taking advantage of the fact that there was all the lane closures going on underneath Interstate 70. This is a view from it that's kind of looking north along Broadway, so you can see there's some really great architecture, some really great fabric here. This is looking on Broadway, looking north, and it's just kind of been this part of the city that there's lots of industry there, lots of things that kind of happen behind buildings that you don't really see. There's not a lot of pedestrian environment here to really walk around and look at stuff, because a lot of it's just happening inside the buildings, and it's doing light industrial work and things like that. This is a shot just further north. This is a very interesting, I think, situation we have, is that this is what's called Produce Row, which is the produce market for the entire St. Louis region. So within this whole environment that we have all this industry and everything else going on, we've got all of our fruits and vegetables that are coming in from all around the Midwest and everywhere else here to get distributed. And I think that it's going to be a really great example of telling that story for folks, because a lot of folks in St. Louis aren't aware that all of our fruits and vegetables throughout the whole region actually come to this spot before they get distributed out to around the city. And then this is something that's basically right next to the Produce Row, which I think is part of another interesting story to tell. I think if this is actually about a $25 million metal recycling facility that's right next to it, that takes a bunch of metal products, cars, pretty much anything that's metal, goes in here and gets tore up and sold for scrap and shipped basically ships onto the river and heads downstream somewhere. It's actually, I think if you're a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old, I've had my nephew out here looking at this. He's fascinated by it, which I think is probably going to be an interesting story to have. I can just imagine kids kind of looking at it and seeing all these cars getting crunched and whatnot. But I think from another perspective, I think it opens up a really serious question as to why we have this operating right next to our fruits and vegetables that are coming out throughout the region. See, there's things I can say out here in Philadelphia that I wouldn't be saying necessarily in St. Louis. So here are a couple of images. As I mentioned in the beginning, we purchased it back in late 2004, 2005 from the Trestle Public Land. We really focused on that upper part that was connecting first, just because that was a very tight time frame. But starting in 2006 and kind of slowly through over the last several years until about 2010, we worked with the neighborhood, worked with the city, worked with a lot of different partners to look at what we would take to really envision this as a project and what would they like to see. So these are just some renderings that we've worked on we've gone through at this point. And this is just a shot sort of looking at it. We would have a separated bicycle and pedestrian path on both sides of it, and it would be landscaped. What's different about this one is that it's not, and you'll see it in a couple of pictures I'll show later, it's not similar to Bloomingdale or even the Highline, where only over the street is it actually sort of the existing bed. Everywhere else is just the trestle itself, and it's bare metal. They took the railroad tracks off of it when it was purchased back in 2005. So it's sort of different in terms of you don't have sort of that bathtub, if you will, like the Highline does, where you actually could put plantings in. We'll be having to install that as part of this project. But this is just a shot of it heading north. And then this is an opportunity that we're going to cantilever and extend across in certain spots. This is one of them right there at Produce Row that I mentioned. That would be a spot where we would actually do some demonstration, agricultural, talk about sort of the fruits and vegetables and all of that. That was one of the things that really came out strongly within the residents there, is really having an opportunity for school kids and folks to really get out and learn more about healthy eating and how to grow their own fruits and vegetables and things like that. Just another shot of it kind of as it makes the bend and heads towards the river. You've got great shots of the Mississippi. At that point, you're going to have really neat views of that new Mississippi River Bridge as it's built, it will be constructed as well. And then just as another shot here as it heads and touches down basically and connects into our existing 12-mile trail on the Mississippi. So here are just a couple shots of it that I've taken. So you can kind of see, this is a shot here where they're actually, you can walk on from the highway up over it. So unfortunately, even before we did this work last summer, it was never, I've always been envious of the photos I've seen of the High Line and in that photo we just saw from Ben and Jamie. It's just like, I wish this was always as pretty and lush, but it's never been all that great. I thought about going up there just with some seed at some point and trying to help do something, which we should do. But yeah, so this is a typical shot of it here. This is kind of what you look like for the most part here. So you have to see how we'll have to build that bathtub that I mentioned to kind of really get the soil depth, to get trees and landscaping and everything up there. Just a couple shots. This is a shot of it as you cross over Interstate 70. You got downtown St. Louis in the background. Here's that makes that bend. This is the port that I mentioned that we have all the stimulus dollars, and then this is our metal recycling right here going on. So you can kind of see that's a lot of very interesting environments that folks would be looking at. And I think that's really important too on this one, is really to raise the awareness of people to really ask that question. Well, really, what is going on over here, and what is all this stuff that's happening? Just another shot of the portion of it that was painted this past summer. One of the things that we did in conjunction with getting it painted was to actually start the Friends of the Trestle organization. We started it last summer, and we actually held our first event. We had 500 folks come out to a free event where we had food trucks, we had music, we had all sorts of folks out there. And then for $25, you were able to access a temporary stair and get up onto the trestle and become a friend of the trestle. And it was a great event. We had beautiful weather. Folks were just really captivated, just kind of looking out and seeing what they could see there and everything. And it's really been part of what we've been doing in getting momentum going on the project. Just a couple more shots. That's our mayor here in the bottom. We actually took him up to the High Line back in 2011 with a bunch of other elected officials and folks as part of the Arch Ground project to kind of look at the High Line as well as other things in New York City. And he's been a strong supporter of it, and really outside of the Arch, he says the Gateway Arch is his #1 development priority, but behind that he really wants to see the trestle and get that moving because he sees the value of really what it could do to transform the neighborhood. This is just an image that we did as part of the project. I just like it because it was really taken as part of the community engagement process. We really worked with folks about what they wanted to see, and so we had our designers kind of put it together into this image, which I've just always been attracted to that, and I think that's a way for us to really go out and we could sell T-shirts and all sorts of things with that on it. But so kind of what, as I mentioned too in the beginning about going back to the voters here in April, and I think an important part of the conversation is that we were marching along from 2006 until about 2010, going through, and we were actually at schematic design. So we were at, I'd say, about 60% or so design of the project. At that same time, in 2010, is when the City Arch River Foundation had the competition for the Arch Grounds, which some of you might know that Michael von Valkenburg Associates was the winner of that project, and ever since 2010 has been working on it. So because of that whole effort and because we were getting involved on the Central Riverfront and really what we could do to make Lenore K. Sullivan Boulevard, which is the road in front of the Arch Grounds on the river, how to make that a better experience, our board made the decision to actually to put the trestle on hold for 2 years until we could kind of get going on the Lenore K. Sullivan and part of that project. Which, from my perspective, being the project manager for the trestle, I was a little disappointed that we kind of were slowing things down. As the only project we did do was to paint the trestle over the highway, but we had really intended to have it built. Actually, the first phase of it built by 2012 was the goal that we were going on. But at this point, I think it's actually a better initiative to do. Just because, for many of you who may have seen, this is the design from Michael von Valkenburg that's being implemented at the park over the highway. Because we went back to the voters and they approved a 3/16 increase, we're essentially doubling our income into the Great Rivers Greenway District, as well as helping to pay a portion of the money is going to go towards bonds that will be generated for the Arch Grounds project, about $300 million worth of different projects within there. So because of that, I think the momentum in terms of how we get the connection, how do we get this connection all the way through, down to the Gateway Mall, to the arch grounds and back up. The 6-mile loop, I think, is really going to be critical to how we do get the success of the trestle and really raise and leverage our dollars with corporate dollars as well. Oh, and here's just a side. This is the Friends of the Trestle. I know we were going to say if folks are interested, you can go to the website now and learn more about the project. Oh, and then lastly, too, I left out in the front out there. There's a brochure, some brochures on the trestle as well as brochure on the district as well. All right, thank you very much.
There we go. All right, we're going to do Philadelphia in 2 7-minute segments. So I'm going to go high speed through the viaduct and the Reading portion on the east side of Broad Street, and then Leah will go onto this side of Broad Street. So I'm going to talk about this in 2 phases. One, simply, obviously the location of this, just immediately north of what is a vibrant and expanding downtown, just north of Chinatown. And the asset itself on the east side of Broad is just a little less than 7 acres and just a little less than a mile in length. There are 2 components to this, just to give you the context. There is the right side of it, which goes from Vine up to Fairmount, which is owned by Reading International, a legacy company from the Reading Railroad. You can see the dates. It began functioning in the late 19th century, continued all the way through to 1984, when the Center City Commuter Tunnel made that obsolete. And then there is the left piece, which is much smaller, just about 30,000 square feet, which was acquired by SEPTA when they were thinking about running the Schuylkill Valley Metro all the way out to Reading. So we have this piece, and then the piece that Leah will talk about will pick up on the west side of Broad Street and continue on out. So the basics about this, not dissimilar to New York and Chicago, but this is both a former passenger and an industrial railroad. And this is just a shot I slightly annotated. The dotted blue line is Broad Street. You're looking to the west. You can see the Inquirer building. That entire top section from Spring Garden down to Callow Hill, going all the way out to 20th Street, was Baldwin locomotives. Blocks and blocks of industrial plants, just to give you a sense of the magnitude. But the whole area around the portion in the foreground was also a huge number of industrial and warehouse manufacturing establishments. It culminated at the Reading Head House, which was an operating train line through the middle 1980s. And of course, that was then converted to the gateway to the Pennsylvania Convention Center. And that huge portion that took it all the way into Center City was severed, except the bridge that connects the Reading Terminal to the new convention center is the original bridge. So today's viaduct, as you probably know, starts just at Vine Street and then spreads north. I drew a line to show where the SEPTA portion picks up. But it splits just north of Callow Hill. One section going to the right is owned by Reading. The section going north of that line is running to the northwest is owned by SEPTA. The Reading Spur runs northeast, and it does this remarkable, in a boring grid city, with the exception of the Parkway and Passyunk Avenue and a few other diagonals. This cuts across the grid in a really remarkable way. It arches over streets. It gives you these remarkable views of landmarks you didn't think you could see from certain places, and it takes you past a certain number of endangered buildings as well. It is very close to former industrial buildings because it was the delivery system to those buildings, and that puts it very close, mostly 10 to 15 feet from industrial buildings, but in some cases 7 to 8 feet. So the connectivity at a second level is a real potential on this viaduct. There are many buildings up there vacant which lend themselves, whether it's to artist lofts, to condos, to apartments, but a huge amount of unused real estate in the area surrounding it. There are windows that afford great views, so whoever lives in these at some point will really see great views of the city. The Reading portion terminates up at Fairmount Avenue, and we began a process with the city in 2010 to look at the whole viaduct just to assess what ought to be done with it. We assessed the components as other people did, in which there are huge amounts of cast iron and steel bridges, lots of rust and corrosion, but all structurally sound. They built these things to last. We can't knock it down. Even a truck hit it recently, didn't budge it. There's filled with lots of retaining walls with contaminants in those retaining walls, but the plants don't seem to mind. They've been growing very, very well. And there are sloping fill areas with contaminants in them as well. The redevelopment alternatives back in 2010 we looked at quickly was demolition, because that was one thing that people were looking at and considering. Urban engineers did core samples up and down, so we know a lot about the conditions of the earth. And quite simply, $50 million to take it down was the estimate in 2010, of which half was disposing of contaminated soil. So half of the cost in the demolition was dealing with the contaminated soil. The renovation alternatives at the time were inspired by the High Line, and what we did is say we want something, but everybody said, well, we admire what you did in New York, but we don't want the Mercedes-Benz they built in New York. Authentic, industrial, local Philadelphia was the theme, but all that said, my admiration for a wonderful, wonderful project. We envisioned this as having at least 2 pathways. It's much wider than the High Line, much wider than the Bloomingdale Trail, so it could have both jogging and bike trails. And the notion was an elevated landscape walkway that would be an amenity and an anchor for a new neighborhood as it has emerged in New York City. But most interestingly here, and not unlike Chicago, the only green space within miles around. This is an area very short on green space. It offers great views of the downtown. And if you look at this map, this is dotting where all the building permits and building activity is occurring in any particular quarter, and you see the blighting influence of the viaduct itself. It has delayed, deterred, and prevented things from happening despite a huge number of people who live and work up in that area. So total renovation when we finished was less expensive than demolition, one of those wonderful moments where you say it's cheaper to save it than to demolish it. And most importantly, we could deal with virtually all of the contamination through cap and cover. So for less than $2 million, you could protect yourself from any of those environmental contaminants. So that conclusion in 2010 was very clearly this can be preserved. One of the key issues that Chinatown had raised at the time was they wanted to see portions of it knocked down to build affordable housing. And we retained Cecil Baker, who had looked at not only the existing buildings, which created lots of opportunity for renovation, but with 32% of the land in this area vacant, there's lots of room for growth of all kinds. We don't have to fight over land use. Chinatown's plan in 2004 had called for a partial demolition, and so what we looked at with Cecil's help, an architect developer who was built for Chinatown, was the triangular parcels. And without going into a lot of detail, he confirmed that you could build affordable housing units that laid out that were functional on triangular parcels. You could achieve their same housing goals without demolishing the viaduct. You could allow for second-level connections from both the community rooms of the facilities and Fax Charter School. So in this rendering, you see Fax Charter on the left with a bridge across and a new housing development. The final piece of this was a comprehensive plan that the city has now completed to look at development in the area. And we concluded, not unlike what we saw in the previous analysis, that while you could gain certain value in the area through demolition, renovation had a much higher impact on value, on investment. What we found with parks across the country is that it spurs other development. So discussions, I'll just say, have been underway with Reading. We'll leave that for questions. But clearly, wanting to move this forward, the community, the city, et cetera, we all said, well, let's focus on what we can control. In this small piece that's owned by SEPTA, we went through a second process here, and just before he left office, Councilman Giachico provided funding to get this project to construction documents. It's been supported by Councilman Squilla, building on the William Penn Foundation and Poor Richard's Charitable Trust, and again, in partnership with the city. There was a look at this very small piece of it that goes from Callow Hill over to 13th and Noble and then on out to Broad Street. This is an area that rises up from grade, as you know, and then goes to the southern part of Callow Hill Street. And the opportunity is to transform this into something that looks like this, and a community engagement process, not unlike what we heard from other cities. Respect the industrial character. Don't make it New York City. That was a very clear imperative. Make it uniquely Philadelphia. There was a clear desire for back room, backyard, park space in this neighborhood and make it expandable in the future. So I'll very quickly then sort of take you through what is now ready really to be built. which is to recognize that huge amounts of improvements are going to occur on North Broad Street and create a gateway, and you reuse that trolley car as both a restaurant and an entrance. Keep Noble Street open, but slow traffic so you could go on there on a bicycle or as a pedestrian. At 13th Street, where it crosses over, install a new stairway, light this in really interesting ways at night, and use the depth of the viaduct. You can plant full trees in there. It's already demonstrated that they've grown on their own. As you come in at 13th and Noble Street, create a community gathering space as the gateway, where one of these few places where this starts at grade, and with very generous landscaping, but preserve as much as you can of the old industrial character or replicate it, but a small quiet garden space. As you move further up, industrial style wooden benches inspired by the ties but with less splinters in them, trees planted where the soil still exists, and as you move here, a series of benches aligned at streets to give you views of the downtown, so you'd be looking down streets at the downtown skyline. And then at the Callow Hill end of the interim part, a major punctuation mark, backyard swings, industrial style, and you'd be a clear visible landmark that would be amenities for people within the neighborhood, with a set of steps that then lead down to Callow Hill Street. So as you drove on Callow Hill, right where the truck hit it, you would see those great industrial swings, kind of a landmark that would mark. And at some point in the future, when we get the next phase, you might move the swings to another place, because clearly being over Vine Street is the best place to see everything. This is a $7 to $8 million project at this point to go from Broad Street to Callow Hill Street, so much more reasonable than, oh my God, where are we going to get the $40 to $50 million for the first phase? As I said, construction documents are complete. We're in the process, after extensive neighborhood engagement, of getting all city approvals and starting what will be the fundraising mode for this. And we see this in partnership with the neighborhood as in the city as an affordable and manageable first step, a kind of proof of concept of what we hope to see as a much larger transformation. And I think Leo will take it from here. Great.
That was so impressive. When I heard that Paul was going to show 88 slides in 7 minutes, I was like, no way. That's not happening. I'm really impressed. I don't know how to follow that. Oh, here we go. And I will say that I consider it a great honor to bring us home as the last presenter. I took Beth's advice to take advantage of the power of listening, and I feel like it's been a very enriching evening for me, just to see all these projects and think of how we can apply similar things to our own project. So I'm a board member of Friends of the Rail Park. It's a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Some of you may have known us previously as Viaduct Green. We recently went through a name change actually in the past few weeks. So we were founded in 2010, and I just wanted to say that I think it's really critical to recognize the efforts of Reading Viaduct Project, who began their advocacy efforts over 10 years ago and really brought awareness of the Reading Viaduct, the 9th Street branch, to a level where people who had more capacity to take that project forward knew about it. So we were formed in 2010, right about the time that Paul Levy started getting involved with Reading Viaduct Project, and our vision, it's kind of taking a broader view of the opportunity here. Our vision is to utilize both the 9th Street branch, the Reading Viaduct, and the city branch to create a 3-mile continuous and connective linear park and recreation path that would traverse several neighborhoods, crossing more than 50 city blocks, and really that our main mission is, our goal is to create a holistic vision for this process. So this is the 9th Street branch that you just heard Paul talk about. As he mentioned, it was a passenger rail line. It's actually 0.6 miles, so that does not include the spur, which is actually a part of the city branch. And as many people who work and live near the 9th Street branch, so that's Callowhill and Chinatown North, they all know that there isn't a lot of green space around, as Paul mentioned. So, you know, the opportunity to create a neighborhood park in Callowhill and Chinatown North is a great opportunity. But we really see there's a lot of opportunity in connecting that site to the city branch, which provides the opportunity of creating a green spine spanning 2.2 miles, connecting some of the city's most treasured arts and cultural institutions, and also ultimately connecting to Fairmount Park. So we'll, just to highlight a few destinations along this route, we have the Inquirer Building right here. This is the Rodin Museum. This is the Perlman Annex to the Art Museum. This is the Art Museum itself. So the city branch was a industrial freight rail line. Towards the end of the 19th century, it was submerged, similar to the Bloomingdale Trail. We had a lot of conflicts with pedestrians. So it was submerged and is still submerged today, and it has a very lush character. In some segments, it feels like you're in a valley. You don't really necessarily know that you're below street level. You don't feel like you're, some people don't expect that when they get down there, it doesn't feel like you're trapped. You're just like, oh, I'm in nature, and there's buildings on the other side. There are some segments of it, some of the blocks are being used, have been repurposed for surface parking. This is actually the back of the Rodin Museum, and there's a slope coming down into this surface parking lot, which would be a natural connection to create this idea of a green spine connecting all of these destinations in Philadelphia. The city branch also goes through a 3,000-foot long tunnel under Pennsylvania Avenue. The tunnel has these natural light shafts in the middle that were ventilation shafts for when the trains would go through there. So it's this really just fascinating, very unique space in Philadelphia that most people don't even realize is under there. And it's kind of hard to tell from this photo, but it actually does have a lot of very unique character to it. It has a vast brick arched ceiling. It's probably around 40 feet tall. It's very wide. The city branch was 4 tracks, so it's a very wide right-of-way. So, and as I mentioned, it ultimately connects to Fairmount Park. So this is when you exit the tunnel and come north, this is an existing pedestrian bridge that takes you over this active CSX rail line at 29th Street, so you can go straight into Fairmount Park from there. And this picture's a little misleading because it's showing, it looks like this is the only additional part of the right-of-way that's not a part of the active CSX rail line, but it's actually much wider over here. It continues to the other wall on the other side. So, where are we now? Someone mentioned, I think the Bloomingdale Trail mentioned getting the dotted line on a map. So it's clear that there's a dotted line on the map for the 9th Street branch. People, have kind of embraced that. I think the High Line has made it easier for people to understand how an elevated park can feel, that it's something that we want. But I think it's a little bit more of a stretch for people to understand that a submerged linear park and recreation path is something that can be a very, pleasant place to experience in the city. So we're really at a stage of cultivating consensus, and we're doing that through community engagement and public awareness, building relationships at the city level with agencies and other organizations in Philadelphia, and expanding our capacity as an organization itself. And we just actually finished a conceptual design process for a segment of the city branch that we'll show you later. So, like many of the other projects, we needed to create a dialogue. But we felt it was critical to create a dialogue before design. How do we bring this idea into communities and talk with people about the opportunities without it being a part of a design process? So that's what we did. We actually drafted these shared values with Reading Viaduct Project, I think 2 summers ago, and then we took it on the road. We had a lot of community meetings. We had a lot of city agency meetings and talking about the 3-mile route and holistic vision, but using these shared values as a foundation and inviting others to tell us, you know, whether or not that we need to add these values or change them. And we have continued to add them and expand on them, and even, you know, into this past fall. So in addition to those kind of shared values for the site itself, one of our core values as an organization is a strong belief in community engagement and inclusive visioning. And I think, you know, the idea of going to the community and having a dialogue before design really speaks to that. But we've had, last year we must have had at least a dozen tours of the route. We have had, you know, visioning events as part of Design Philadelphia and other things, really just to kind of make people excited about it and also hear their ideas about it. And then we brought those values and the things that we learned from that experience of engaging with people and talking to people about their ideas to a conceptual design study of a portion of the city branch. This is actually an early graphic of what the site, how the site was defined. It actually, it begins at 13th Street. So those renderings that you saw that were part of Paul's presentation were all on this kind of loopy part right here. So we pick up at the end of that and go across Broad, and it actually goes all the way to 18th. So that includes, this up here is the Community College of Philadelphia. And the Community Design Collaborative here in Philadelphia has this amazing program called the Service Grant Program, which makes you know, design services available to nonprofits at a greatly discounted rate. And we were able to recruit just a stellar, like amazing rock star design team led by Olin, and also including Bolin Sawinski Jackson, CVM engineers, and VJ Associates to take us through this conceptual design. And we also had a task force of 40 stakeholders and, you know, representatives from city agencies, you know, council reps, you know, variety of people who we felt were necessary to engage in this process. And one of the main driving reasons why we chose this site is that we know that there are a number of points along the city branch that we need to work on restoring and preserving the right-of-way. You know, the 9th Street branch is pretty much intact, and it's owned by one single landowner, but the city branch, the right-of-way itself is owned by SEPTA, but there are a number of locations along the city branch where properties extend over the top at street level. So, you know, the segment that we focused on is this segment right here, where we have the Community College of Philadelphia extending a full block, and then these two blocks, which are both privately owned and publicly owned. This is where the city branch goes underneath Broad Street next to the Inquirer building, and this is also the site of the proposed Provence Casino. So this is one of the 6 proposed casinos vying for the second casino license in Philadelphia. And at present, the proposal would deck over 2 blocks of the city branch. So that's one of the reasons why we selected this site, to think, you know, we need to create a vision for the city branch being open to the sky in order for this proposed development not to conflict with that vision. So when you're standing on Broad Street looking west, and this is the Inquirer building to the left, this is the School District Administration building, and this is, you know, which is a very architecturally relevant, like the, you know, building and treasured building in Philadelphia. It's Albert Kahn designed it in 1948. And this is a 1990 addition to that building. That was not supposed to be a joke. But it has no windows. It's mostly used for storage, and a portion of it is used for their IT department. And the reason why I'm saying this is because we're proposing that it be removed. So this is the only actual impediment to the entire 3-mile structure. If this addition wasn't there, you could walk continuously along the whole 3-mile route without crossing a single street. So this is kind of what I call the money shot of our conceptual design, really illustrating what the opportunity is, that you could create a very striking linear park and recreation path here with active connections to the adjacent buildings. You know, that doesn't feel scary. It's not, you know, constricting. But also, one thing that I love about this is the proposal of this ramp coming up along Broad Street. And so you would come from Hamilton down into the City Branch, and it really creates this very strong civic presence for the school district administration building. This is a view underneath Broad Street looking west. The City Branch is a tremendous opportunity for stormwater management. So the team really looked hard at opportunities for green infrastructure, and given the water department's ambitious plans for green infrastructure, I think this is a really huge opportunity for them. Looking at the entire site, it's really bookended by the civic connection at Broad Street and also this campus connection at the community college, which we feel would really activate, both of these things would really activate the City Branch. And this is a view from next to the community college campus, where they had this really nice proposal to take the existing masonry block wall and step it back into a terraced surface there that would connect to the campus itself. That's it, and we actually have some maps and a sign-in sheet if you want to receive updates from Friends of the Rail Park at the next city table outside.
So if I could ask all the panelists to join us on stage, and I just want to thank them again for a wonderful set of presentations, and if I could ask for another round of applause for our wonderful panelists. So I know we're running a little bit behind on our schedule. I had lots of prepared questions. I added pages of questions as I listened. I won't take you through all those. But I do want to ask a couple of questions, and then afterwards I want to make sure we leave time for you to ask questions about how these projects came to be and where they are and what needs to happen next. So you'll see that there are microphones down at the front of the room. So we would ask you to come down to the microphones. We're hoping we can stay just a little bit beyond 8 o'clock, but we'll see what we can do. So. What I heard in your presentations, there were themes that emerged, that leadership, how important leadership is, multiple stakeholders, and lots of commitment to collaboration, building coalitions, public-private partnerships. And I guess it makes me think about the role of elected officials. And we have a very diverse panel in terms of being from friends groups or development agencies, but no elected officials. And I was struck by the example that Todd gave. The question is, how important is it to engage your elected officials? And then how do you do it? And I guess I'll start with Todd, because I was struck by, you took your mayor to the High Line. And so I was curious what led up to that and what was the impact of taking him to see the High Line?
Well, the reason that we took him in 2011 was as part of the Arch Grounds competition with Michael Van Valkenburg. He had already been selected. They were already in design and working with the community, and they had tons of meetings at that point. They wanted to take a whole bunch of folks up to New York to kind of look at various projects that Michael had worked on in Brooklyn and other places. But we put together sort of our own roster of things we wanted to see, and so we had the High Line on there for sure. So that was really just one of about 4 or 5 different things that we saw, and we made sure that he saw it at night as well. We had dinner close by, and then we actually took them up there during the daytime, and then also at night to really see the beautiful, how it was lit up, how people were enjoying it, which he just really fell in love with and just really was captivated and just was out there watching people, just how they were engaging with it and all that. So that's really what brought that. But I do think that having your local officials aware and supportive of the project is really critical.
So Danya, you talked about opposition, and clearly you had an elected official you were dealing with from the get-go. So how did you work with other elected officials to sort of stem that tide of opposition?
Yeah, it was before my time, but from what I understand, it was the early sort of ages, or the early pieces of getting different elected officials on board was a lot about giving them reasons to get on board. Each person had their own sort of reason or different constituency that they were looking to engage with a little bit more. For example, I think our city council person at the time expressed an interest in getting involved with the arts community a little bit more, because traditionally sometimes artists aren't as politically active, and we were able to speak to the arts community, and so that gave our city council person a reason to get involved with us. And another congressperson was a fan of rail sort of history, and when we found that out, we were like, oh great, that'll be his reason for getting on board. And so, sort of I think each elected official had their own reason, but it was about us taking the time to, again, listen to the reasons why they would be on board, and then work to meet them at what they were looking to do as well.
So Paul, what's your strategy for working with elected officials to get this done?
Leigh already mentioned one. I think it's hard to see with lights. Is that you, John, sitting right there, John? Okay, John Struble and Sarah McEnany really have carried this for 10 years, 12 years, I think, very much inspired by New York City. So I think there's been a community group that has been carrying this project for a while. I think the High Line, I always like to say, is our greatest ally and our worst enemy. It's our greatest ally because so many people have been inspired by going up there. It's our greatest enemy because certain owners now see billions of dollars of value in an asset that just 10 years ago was worthless. But I think, the proof of concept that I think New York did was incredibly helpful, and for us in Philadelphia being so close, so many people have gone up there. So I know our mayor has seen it. Our last councilman for this district, Councilman DeCicco, was very well aware of this. He saw the interest in the community, and I think he came on board very well. I think the challenge, which we've mostly worked through now with a lot of help from the community groups in the city, is there was at one point conflicting aspirations. The Chinatown community, you heard it referred to as Chinatown North, there's the Callow Hill area, and there was some conflict over whose land was it. I think that's largely been resolved, one, by the fact with 32% of the land vacant, there's a lot of room for everybody, but two, in that the city then did a comprehensive plan, which I think found room. So I think it made it easier for the elected officials to see that multiple groups could achieve their objectives here.
Leah, did you want to add to that from the Philadelphia perspective and how you're advancing the vision for the
Sure. As far as engaging council people specifically, when we had our conceptual design process, we had 2 council reps as a part of our task force. So that was helpful, I think, as a first step of making them aware of this other opportunity of the city branch. And I think that's just something that we need to continue to work on, getting them on board, and also, the planning side of things is another thing where the central district, which encompasses both both sides of the project, was just completed, and it includes the Reading Viaduct in the plan as a planned linear park and recreation space, but it does not recognize the city branch as that. It has a competing vision. Some people see it as a competing vision. We see it as, potentially a parallel vision, but that's using the city branch for bus rapid transit. So we are now in the review phase for the Central District Plan, which should end, I believe, in the summer sometime. So it's really on us to kind of bring that issue to the Planning Commission and say that, there are other alternative visions for the city branch.
So Jamie and Ben, you want to share your perspective on the role of the elected officials? And
well, I was gonna just expand. Elected officials, I think people have addressed, but it got me thinking about elected officials exist, I think, within or on top of agencies, and agencies sometimes have longer institutional power than elected officials that sometimes come and go, and within those agencies there's plans, and they're thinking very long term, and communities are thinking very long term. And I think it was incredibly important for us, and I think what we heard in St. Louis and other places, that we made a very deliberate effort to weave our project into existing plans. So not just the Logan Square Open Space Plan that I talked about, but the Bloomingdale existed in bike visions going back to the late 90s, and that was incredibly important for us. And it goes back even further. Bloomingdale goes over our boulevard system, so it ties in with Burnham, and there's much larger greenways in Chicago. And we talked about it constantly as kind of extending and completing this vision. And I think that kind of sweetened things for the elected officials. It made it easier for them to say yes. So, and similar things with community visions that had emerged. And in several of the neighborhoods along the Bloomingdale, they had created neighborhood visions, and Bloomingdale was part of it, not just out of thin air, but because we went to those meetings and really advocated because we knew it was important that it was part of it. So.
Jamie, did you want to add?
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think that the role of your elected officials can make or break a project. The aldermen that control the areas that the Bloomingdale Trail runs through have always been supportive. But in May of 2011, we got a new mayor, Rahm Emanuel, and although Mayor Daley, prior to him, was supportive of the project, nothing fast-tracked this project like Mayor Emanuel supporting this as both a campaign promise as well as a mayoral priority. So you have to have the support of your elected officials, but once you do, watch out, because then some real deadlines come into play, and you have to put up and make it happen, which is great for the project, but it also, you have to be ready to take that on.
So, Danya, I'm going to start with you with this question, since you're so much further along. And it struck me when you gave your presentation about the unanticipated consequences. I mean, you figured you'd have 350,000 visitors, and you have over 3 million. So what would you have done differently, if you could, to prepare for that?
Good question. Well, since I'm here and I run the programming, I'm going to answer from that perspective mainly. I think that one of the things that's been challenging for me is looking at sort of negotiating how to bring multiple constituencies into a sort of a vision that everyone agrees on, which is sort of what we had to do to build the High Line. But now, once it's built, how do you decide on sort of a set of initiatives and what to use the park for? And what I would like to use it for a lot is sort of contrary to what visitors would like to use it for, other people would like to use it for. And so I think it's sort of I think some of the things that I would have done are sort of looking at gathering spaces, looking at access points, which I think all of the other projects here represented are looking at gathering spaces and access points, which is really, really wonderful. Sort of looking at integration into the neighborhood. I think it would have been interesting to think about that. Although I do think that there is some difference in the density of Manhattan that sort of lends itself to needing a bit more of an escape, and that's a positive as opposed to integration. But yeah, I think thinking a little bit more about the use of the space would have been something that I would have liked us to do a little bit more.
So let me ask you, and I'll start with Jamie. So how do you balance the desire for a public space that is supposed to serve local parks? And these are 4 neighborhoods. It's not downtown Chicago. So how do you balance that desire to have a local park, but also something that's spectacular, when spectacular is helping with the fundraising, which is half of the budget? And, thinking, coming from Danya's perspective just now, I mean, this needs to serve the neighborhood, which there wasn't one before, but now there is, but it's also a tourist destination. But in these other parks, and I'd love to hear from you, and then Todd and Paul and Leah, how are you trying to think about that? But Jamie, if you'd kick that off.
Sure. It's something we hear about, as you know, quite a bit with this project. That on the one hand, it's a very local project. It goes through 4 neighborhoods, as we mentioned, but unlike the High Line, it's in mostly residential area that is a decent density, but not high density areas. So it's at once this neighborhood park with these access parks that will have local community advisory councils overseeing them and helping with the programming, and at the same time with the involvement of the city agencies and our mayor, and wanting to rival the High Line in some ways, it will also be elevated to this tourist destination that we think will attract people from around the country and around the world. And I think the way that we've been trying to balance that is by always coming back to the community with everything. Everything from what are we doing about parking to what are we doing about bathrooms? Will there be drinking fountains? What are the hours of operation? Is this thing going to be plowed in the winter so we can continue to use it, or can we go cross-country skiing? And those are all very local issues to be addressed. And so in our day-to-day and our extensive outreach with the community, we're always making sure that the decisions that we make are comfortable for the neighbors and make sense to them and are decisions that they can live with. And I think it'll be spectacular as a neighborhood park, and it'll be spectacular as a destination as well. And I also think as we continue to develop our programming, which Danya was talking about, that will also help define certain events and programming and spaces that have more of a local appeal than what might appeal to someone who's coming just for a weekend visit to Chicago.
Todd, how are you trying to address that, given the scale of your project and that it fits into this really large system?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you look at the Arch Grounds, which attracts about 3 million people a year to it. I don't envision that we're going to be getting a lot of the folks that are going to the Arch Grounds to come and do the 6-mile loop per se, but I do think there'll be a certain amount that are there just from either a recreational standpoint or just from curiosity because they've heard about similar projects around the country. I think that we've always gone and talked to the local residents and folks in the community. I think out of the 4 projects, we're probably in the one that's situated in the lowest density in terms of residents as well as the daytime population. So it's kind of challenging for us to kind of try to engage business owners and stuff who have a different set of concerns about access and operation and whatnot than residents are on the east or the west side of the Interstate 70 because they're looking for more from a local park perspective. But I think we've been balancing that pretty well, and we're getting ready to go out this summer to have another round of public meetings to kind of really talk about, now that we're going to be proceeding on the first phase of it in the next 2 years, what we're going to be doing in terms of local access, uses, things that they want, and things that are really geared more towards the local residents, local community.
Paul and Leah, do you want to reflect on that?
Coming up to your question shortly, but I think what we're not talking about here is the huge operating costs to carry these things.
That's
and so
my
there's
very next question.
Right. Okay. So I mean, I'll just jump
we
in.
Think
alike. We had a much smaller scale and analogous experience to New York when we opened Sister Cities Park here last summer, in which we had a boat pond for well-behaved children that lasted 2 days and before it became completely overrun as a swimming pool. And we had to rip out the entire filtration system and put in essentially a filtration system for a swimming pool. So there's a huge appetite for public spaces that people want to use. And yet, as hard as it is to raise the capital side of this, the operating costs are frankly even harder because we're not sitting up here. Even New York has budget challenges at this point. So I think what we also have to keep in mind is both we want to be sensitive to the community, but there have got to be events that raise money on these plazas to support the operating costs, or that beautiful vision looks pretty awful in 2 years. So I think we have to be more focused on those operating costs.
I guess I would just add, getting back to how do you balance users from a local perspective and really allowing the project to become an asset to neighbors with serving tourism and kind of bringing more dollars into our economy. I think we have a distinct advantage, and if you look at the entire 3-mile route and what it goes by. Because for one thing, we have Callow Hill and Chinatown North, which have no green space at all. So in and of itself, the 9th Street branch becomes an incredible asset for those communities in that very hardscaped part of the city. But when you think about the connectivity to Fairmount Park, then it becomes a real asset for people in the city of Philadelphia. Like giving this 3-mile bike and pedestrian path that connects all these communities to Fairmount Park and creates this very unique experience along the way, but also the proximity to all the cultural and arts destinations along the parkway. I don't even have to make an argument for how it would serve both residents and tourists, just because by nature of where it is. And also, I would say the community college too is there. It doesn't really have a campus right now, so that Linear Park could really serve those students who are going back and forth to the Broad Street line.
I did want to get to stewardship, but I think there are lots of folks in the audience who probably have questions. So would anyone like to start us off with a question? If you'd come down to the mic so we can hear your question.
I was just going to say we have about 10 minutes, so maybe 2 or 3 questions from the audience would be great.
Great.
Thanks.
Hi.
Hi, my name's Andrew Thompson. I work in the Wolf Building, GIS company called Azavia. And I had a question for the other three cities, because I didn't hear it in your presentations, or maybe I missed it, about any struggles that you had with whoever the current owner of the right-of-way was. Because there was a bit of a subtext here in most of the talk, but we never directly addressed it, that the Reading Railroad Company is not exactly welcome to the idea right now of turning over ownership and stuff like that. And I was just curious to see how the other cities had dealt with that if they had current owners.
I mean, in Chicago, I remember the day back in like 2005 when we went to the Chicago Department of Transportation, and they gleefully came in with the document showing that the city owned Bloomingdale Avenue underneath the Bloomingdale embankment. So we did not have the same challenges that they have in New York.
Yeah, I was going to, and in fact, that lease that allowed the railroad to build an embankment in the middle of the street was up. As Ben said, it's 100 years old, the lease is up, so it forced everybody's hand to figure out what to do with the structure. So in that way, we were pretty lucky.
Railroad was eager to get rid of it, right? So
Yeah,
how
in
about you,
St.
Tom?
Louis, it was actually owned by a railroad holding company, and we actually had talked to them probably about 2 or 3 years in advance of when we bought it in 2004, but they just, for whatever reason, all of a sudden decided that they no longer wanted the asset, and so they started to talk to us, and that's how it happened back then.
Yeah, it was similar with us. There were two things. One was CSX Transportation owned the High Line, and they were pretty eager to get rid of it. They didn't know what to do with it, so we negotiated them donating it to the city. And then the other piece was the rezoning, because under the High Line is still owned by lots of different private property owners. And so that rezoning, which is called a transfer of development rights, which is something that is happening a lot in New York right now, which means that you can buy or sell sort of rights to a certain area and transfer them to another site in the neighborhood, which means that the underlying property owners could then not lose the value of their land underneath the High Line. So those were the two things. I think in general, sort of the ability for us to work with the mayor's office and the Department of City Planning really helped in both of those negotiations and rezonings. So that was how we did it.
So basically the answer is everybody else got off really easy.
Well, I mean, I would add one thing to that, which is, sometimes we did get off really easy, but we had to worry a lot about access points and these adjacent parks, and I think there was a parallel story of, I wouldn't say struggle, but being strategic about how we went about that, and this is really where the Trust for Public Land played a role, working with the city of Chicago and making sure that we were careful about getting those strategic parcels along the 3-mile corridor, so we weren't left with a park that no one could get to.
Paul, did you want to speak to that?
No.
You touched on it in your you touched on it in your presentation, and I think it's interesting over the perspective of the time frame, and they see it now as a thing of great value, where in Chicago and perhaps St. Louis it was defunct, and New York, it was of no value at that time. So
No, I mean, there
how
are
much does
advantages
that
to
play
being far
into
away
it?
from New York City. I mean, in terms, because, no, very seriously, Reading wanted to give the asset to the city in the 1990s, and the city didn't finally decide to take it. So we had a huge missed opportunity. I mean, it will work out. It's not an easy process because they now look at New York City and they say, oh my God, this thing isn't a worthless asset. We can do $200 million condos here. And our conversation, oh, it's a very depressed market here in Philadelphia. It's really not at all like New York City. So there is, I mean, I don't want to minimize their legitimate interest in owning it and seeing value in the future. I think they will ultimately come to understand that the only way to realize the value of that asset is when it's in public ownership, because it's going to take public and foundation money to deal with the conditions. I don't think they've really fully appreciate the contamination that they own at this point. So it's a slow process, it's a frustrating process, but they're the owners, and whenever you're in a real estate negotiation, you can't just wish ill on the person just because they don't want to give it to you. You have to work through it with them.
It's a great question. Danya, did you want to add
No, I
something?
did just want to say that it's really easy for me to look back on those negotiations and say that they were really quick and easy, but they were not. They took years, and they were difficult, and there were lots of roadblocks, and we weren't facing the same challenges, but it took a huge amount of perseverance and patience on the part of all of the negotiators. So
That's true in
you know,
Chicago as well.
And
Yeah.
legal,
I would just add in that the people who did the deal in New York for Conrail, who helped make it happen, are being incredibly helpful to Philadelphia. So there are good railroads in the world.
So we have a question?
Paul, it warms my heart to hear you say the swings belong over the Vine Street Expressway, because like other people, I believe it should go all the way into Reading Terminal Market.
Sure.
But my worry is that Leah talked about the competing dreams for the branch that goes out to Girard Avenue. And dreams are nice, but I'm wondering if anybody has actually told SEPTA how logistically it's impossible to do what they want. I run 18-wheelers all throughout Philadelphia, and you can have the nicest bus you want, but once you come up to grade on Girard, you have Girard, the trolley, you have the zoo traffic, you have 2 ramps to 76, you have a new high school there, Bill Gates High School, and on the east side, when it comes up to Broad, it's physically impossible. And it sounds romantic, but there are no buses that run totally electric that can run air, a kneeling bus, and a ramp. It's not physically possible. I know it's nice to talk about dreams, but has anybody said, look, you're going to waste a ton of money and tear down, you know? It seems ridiculous.
I said this earlier, but I teach out at Penn, and I always remind my students about the power and the delusionary nature of Photoshop, right? Because we have just transformed these places just with the snap of a finger, and they're absolutely beautiful. I mean, I may share your opinion about this notion of a bus route, but I again respect that SEPTA owns the assets, right? So we can be frustrated with that, but we can dream about other people's property. Ultimately, you have to negotiate with who owns that property to get where you want. So I mean, to me, to put a visitor bus route out of sight makes very little sense, okay? A visitor bus route would have to be based on impulse decisions. But that's at least one thing that's being considered. So it's got to be respected. I don't think it will hold up over time. And I think just like we found out with the prison up on Fairmount Avenue, for years we studied 65 other uses for it until we concluded the only use was an abandoned prison. And then we turned it into a very successful museum.
Isn't part of the plan for the Parkway the possible, putting a trolley along the Parkway and around?
Sure. I mean, my own view, in that if you're going to have a tourist-oriented loop, and we operated the Flash for a number of years, you need to put it where people see it.
Thank you.
And I would just want to clarify that that's actually not SEPTA's plan. It's coming from the Planning Commission. So it's interesting also to note that SEPTA did a ridership study for the city branch a number of years ago and concluded that there wasn't sufficient demand to justify a new transit route in the city branch. So we're not really sure why the Planning Commission feels like now it's necessary to do that. And like you pointed out before the presentation started, just the idea of putting bus rapid transit in the city branch, you don't really have the rapid because you're only going for a certain distance, and then on either side you're going to get totally snarled. And I don't understand the engineering logistics of how they're going to get the buses in and out myself. I don't know if the Planning Commission has looked into that specifically, but
Plus, I'd feel
I
like
share your
a cow
frustration.
in a kill chute with buses running by. As the east side of Broad, you have beautiful condos and the High Line type. Up on the west side, you got buses running in the middle, and the people are shoved to the side like cattle in a chute. It doesn't seem attractive to a politician when votes are concerned.
well, having the path parallel to bus rapid transit is definitely not our preferred scenario by any means. But that's kind of our primary concern is preserving and restoring the right-of-way right now, and either vision would require doing that. So,
I just want to thank you because I think your question and the question before really illustrates how important it is to have different perspectives. I mean, you have a very different perspective because of the work that you do and how you travel through the city. And I think it's a really good way to end our discussion about how challenging these projects are. But clearly, they're also very inspiring. They are doable. I think we have a panel who will make sure that all of these projects happen. And I just want to thank everyone for being here and remind you to please fill out the evaluation forms and leave them at the back. The university is doing a very thoughtful evaluation of all of their education programs and visitor experiences. So your feedback is very important. So if you would please join me in giving another round of applause, first to Next City. Thank you. We so appreciate what Next City does to bring together these types of thinkers and doers who are changing the face of our cities, and also for our wonderful panel. Thank you all so much for a great discussion.